Unlike Muller, Rolla had a wealth of translated material to use when he began his research. His source material included the early translations of the Kathamrita and the Leela Prasanga, Muller's Ramakrishna, his life and sayings, and Dhanagopal Mukherjee's exotic biography of Ramakrishna titled The Face of Silence. In addition, Rolla corresponded with Swami Shivananda, Mahapurush Maharaj, M. and Swami Ashokananda. He also received help from Swamiji's American disciples, Josephine MacLeod and Sister Christine. Rolla's heart longed for unity and harmony in a Europe devastated by World War I, and what attracted him to Sri Ramakrishna's life and teachings was the hope that Ramakrishna would provide the much needed restorative and antidote to political madness and human suffering. Although Rolla's book on Ramakrishna was written in French and first published in 1929, it was its English translation that received wider circulation and acclaim. As a die-hard humanist and idealist, Rolla assumed that Ramakrishna and other religious teachers shared with him what, according to him, was the one universal goal: human unity through God. Compared to Muller's dry analytical style, Rolla's book is filled with passion and energy. He focuses more on Ramakrishna's life and his teachings and its larger meaning for humanity. Not overtly enthused by Sri Ramakrishna's mystical experience of the divine as pervading everyone and everything, Rolla is concerned over what he felt was Sri Ramakrishna's lack of engagement in human suffering. It must have taken a while before Rolla realized that his own ideology was at odds with Ramakrishna's worldview, which perceived the world as only temporarily remediable but intrinsically unfixable. We find that not long after Rolla's book was published, he gave up his interest in religion and became increasingly involved in socialism and combating fascism through armed resistance. Another great book on Ramakrishna, published almost 35 years later, was Christopher Isherwood's Ramakrishna and His Disciples. Written at the request of his teacher, Swami Prabhavananda, Isherwood dedicates the book to him, describing him as my guru, dear friend, and literary collaborator for the past 25 years. Although a book of this nature was so different from the kind of books Isherwood had written and become famous for, it was nevertheless both a challenging and gratifying project for him. This is what Isherwood wrote in a 1946 essay: Ramakrishna is the most interesting person to write about, the most interesting and the most difficult. 11 years later, in his diary entry of June 10, 1957, Isherwood writes, I ask myself, what am I fit for nowadays? What am I accomplishing? What does my life mean? And the answer seems to be, I have to write that Ramakrishna book. That will sum up what my life has been about since the 30s. Isherwood's source materials were primarily the English translations of the Kathamrita and the Leela Prasanga. Recognizing that his book's primary audience was likely to be Ramakrishna devotees and a much larger proportion of skeptical Western readers, Isherwood interprets Ramakrishna's life through the eyes of a skeptic, but also making it clear that he believed Ramakrishna to be an avatar. In order to remove misconceptions regarding mysticism, Isherwood emphasizes the ordinary in Sri Ramakrishna's life to show that Ramakrishna's mystical experiences were an extension of what was inherent in ordinary human life, available to everyone if only they could open their hearts to it. Isherwood's book became hugely popular among Ramakrishna devotees, and it attracted a sizable number of young men and women in the West, many of whom became lifelong devotees, and a few among them eventually became monastics of the Ramakrishna Order. The interpretations of Ramakrishna that emerged in the Western academic world in the 1970s present a different dynamic and a somewhat jarring change of tone from the generally admiring books of Muller, Rolla, and Isherwood. While the earlier interpreters did not question the legitimacy of the sources they worked with, the Western academics in the 1970s were not prepared to assume the accuracy and trustworthiness of the source materials. The hermeneutic of empathy had been replaced by the hermeneutic of suspicion. The writings of Walter Neville, Jeffrey Mason, Narasimha Seal, Malcolm MacLean, and Jeffrey Kripal, among others, interpreted Ramakrishna's mystical experiences as caused by psychopathology, doubted that it was ever possible to transcend one's body consciousness, and subjected Ramakrishna's words and experiences to Freudian psychoanalysis. Not surprisingly, their interpretations and conclusions were markedly different from the earlier ones. By and large, their interpretations circulated within and remained confined to the Western academic world, just as the earlier interpretations were preserved and studied primarily in the worldwide devotee circles. Only when the two worlds, academic and non-academic, collided, as it happened after the publication of the review of Kripal's Kali's Child in the Calcutta edition of the Statesman in 1997, did it lead to controversy and protests, and much mud throwing from both the sides. Not all academics, however, operated with the hermeneutic of suspicion. There were some notable exceptions, historian Amir Sen among them, whom we had the pleasure to listen this morning. And Professor Sen, thank you for your insightful observations you made in this morning's session. In Professor Sen's Hindu Revivalism in Bengal, published in 1993, he offers an insightful interpretation of Ramakrishna's life and his role in reviving the Hindu tradition. He points out that Ramakrishna was a many-layered personality with diverse possibilities latent in his life and message. I would strongly recommend that those of you who can get a hold of this book and the latest book that has just been published, please go through that to see how Ramakrishna can be viewed from the perspective of our own present times. The interpretations of Ramakrishna's life and teachings in the Ramakrishna Order after Swami Sharadananda's Leela Prasanga came not through full-length biographies but through essays, editorials and books. The earliest among these were Swami Ghanananda's Ramakrishna and his unique message, Swami Nirvedananda's Sri Ramakrishna and Spiritual Renaissance, and Swami Jnaneshwarananda's Ramakrishna, the Man and the Power. In two essays published in 1962 and 1980, both published in the Order's Bengali journal Udbodhan, Swami Dhireshananda points out that any attempt to force Ramakrishna's life into a straitjacket of a single philosophy or tradition is bound to produce distortion. He writes that Ramakrishna was the embodiment of infinite bhavas, Ananta Bhavamaya, and raises an interesting question regarding the nature of Ramakrishna's first mystical experience of the Divine Mother. Through his extensive research, Swami Prabhananda has brought to light heretofore little-known incidents from Ramakrishna's life, especially those from the untranscribed portions of M's diaries, and this has deepened and enriched our knowledge and understanding of Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Bhajanananda's editorials have highlighted the significance and meaning of Ramakrishna's life with insightful interpretations of the state of Bhavamukha and Ramakrishna's concept of Vijnana. This is only a brief glimpse, a very, very brief glimpse of the interpretations of Ramakrishna's life and teachings in English that have enriched the Ramakrishna literature. These interpreters have helped us look at Ramakrishna through different perspectives, and while we may not agree with every interpretation we come across, it cannot be denied that each viewpoint helps us go back and compare it with our own viewpoint, if we have one, and see where the meeting of the two leads us. That's the whole point, isn't it, of why interpretations are offered and why they are studied. It's not so much a matter of agreeing or not agreeing with, or accepting or rejecting any interpretation. That's secondary. What is primary is the question, does this interpretation help me go closer to the truth, to the inner essence of the person or the idea that is being interpreted? It is possible to look at the raw information of a person's life as the raw material needed to build a house, such as bricks, mortar, wood, and metal. Every interpretation is like a house, built using the available material. The object of interpretation is not the house itself, but the one who lives in that house. What kind of house gets built, its style and design and quality depends on the one who builds it. Ideally, the house should reflect the personality of the one living in it. Now, how do we build a house for someone whom we have never met? All that we have is some raw information about the events in the person's life and about what the person said on various occasions. In such a scenario, we have to imagine how that person must have been and then build a house that would best reflect the personality of its inhabitant. That is what every interpretation tries to do. When an architect is perfectly tuned to the vision and the need of the client for whom the house is being designed and built, the style and nature of the house perfectly reflects the personality of the owner. When the architect uses his or her own vision, the house reflects the personality of the architect, not of the owner. But that is essentially the difference between a good interpretation and a bad interpretation. In Sri Ramakrishna's case, we can see easily the different interpretative houses that were built for him by M. Sharadananda, Ramchandra Datta, Muller, Rolla, Isherwood and others. It is possible that we might find some of these houses as more likely residences of Ramakrishna than some others. It is also possible that the house you or I would build for him may be in some ways different from any of the houses that others have built for him. It is most essential never to forget that an interpretation of Ramakrishna is not Ramakrishna himself, but only a house that is built for him. While the interpretation may give us some idea of one who is living in the house, merely looking at the house and admiring it is never going to be enough. At some point, we will want to open the door, go in and meet Ramakrishna directly. The house that makes us do this quickly and easily would be in some way the ideal house for us. That is how I see our relationship with Ramakrishna literature, specifically with the different interpretations of Ramakrishna's life and teachings that are now available and also with the interpretations that may come in the future.